Direct from 7 News headquarters, the latest on the coronavirus outbreak with Michael Usher.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of the latest from 7 News. We'll keep you right across all of the up-to-the-minute details surrounding the outbreak in Australia tonight. Right now, as we go to air, there are over 560 cases across Australia. As you can see here, no state or territory has been spared. We have growing infection rates right across the board. Over the next hour, to help guide you through all of the numbers, essential advice and the changing way of life we're all about to face, I'll be joined by our leaders, Australia's top medical minds, and we'll hear from someone who's right now suffering from COVID-19 as we pinpoint and provide you with the vital insights into all of today's developments shaping the new norm.
Michael, today the Prime Minister was very clear on the rules we must all now abide by, declaring the country is in the midst of a human biosecurity emergency. We've seen unprecedented measures to shut down our borders. Level 4 travel restrictions are now in place. There is no Level 5. Also, no indoor gatherings with more than 100 people in places like pubs, restaurants and even churches. There are exceptions like shopping centres, hospitals and train stations. Supermarkets are imposing more limits to try to stop panic buying. Scott Morrison condemned the frenzied stockpiling we've been seeing.
Stop doing it. It's ridiculous. It's un-Australian and it must stop. And I would ask people to do the right thing by each other.
There are also strict new rules on visiting aged care centres. As for the kids, schools will remain open. No changes there. But, Michael, as we've seen, this is a moving feast and the advice is subject to change on a daily basis.
So let's dig a little deeper into the science behind the decisions made by the government. I'm joined by infectious disease social researcher Dr Holly Seal now. Holly, thank you so much for joining the latest. Scott Morrison said we're looking at a situation of at least 6 months. Where would that time frame have come from?
What we're looking at is the data that we've seen coming out of China. You know, we're now getting a lot of papers published using good data, the epidemiology from China, that's really then helping us to shape our epidemiology and our mathematical modelling.
The PM ruled out a complete 2-week shutdown, Holly, saying it wouldn't be effective. In your opinion, why is that?
Yeah, look, that 14-day comment came from the US, the director for the National Institute for Hygiene and Infectious Diseases. And look, it's we can understand the kind of the rationale for that. You know, they're trying to buy time, they're trying to reduce the burden in our hospitals and so forth. And, you know, if you talk to the modelers and the epidemiologists, you know, they do assume that that would have some sort of effect, but not the level of effect that we really need now. What we understand from China is that their strategies took about 8+ weeks to really have the impact that we need to get from a place where they were having 3,000 cases a day all the way down to 30 cases a day. And so our Prime Minister and our government is thinking that longer term, needing to put in those measures so that, you know, after 14 days, people just don't go back and start thinking that life's going to return to normal. We need longer term strategies right now.
And do you think the banning or the restriction on these mass gatherings, that's the right way to go and the reasoning behind it's correct?
Look, it's a logical next step for the government. You know, we've seen the travel restrictions. This is just their next strategy that they've got in their toolkit. And again, you know, overseas we have seen cases happening after mass gatherings. There was a conference in the US, there was the church incident in South Korea. All of these situations led to more transmission in communities, and that's what the government's trying to stop.
Let's talk about boosting hygiene, general hygiene across workplaces, schools, public places. Probably a little difficult to enforce. I know in our workplace everyone's certainly got on board with it. But how do we actually enforce that?
Look, we can't can't enforce it, but we want to make it a social norm. We want everyone to realise that this is just going to be part of our common day language now. So we may need to make it as easy as possible. We may need to put those sanitisers, the hand dispensers, at lifts or frequent touch points so that people can't just kind of ignore it. It's in their face and it will have to happen. You know, we know that using soap and water is going to be our best strategy, but if you don't have access to those things, what can you do? You could put some hand sanitizer in your pocket so that it's a trigger point to you and it's easy and accessible. We may need to just give each other a bit of a nudge. Now, that's not a physical nudge, but just that kind of friendly reminder that, you know, you're not doing the wrong thing, but hey, let's help each other here.
I think people are getting on board. I don't think Australia's had cleaner hands at any other point in our history right now. Holly?
No.
All right, Dr. Holly Seal, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's bring in our political correspondent, Tim Lester, who's in Canberra. Of course, Tim, good evening to you. So, a big suite of new measures from the Morrison government today. I expect that this is not going to be the end of it.
Not by a long shot, Michael. In fact, the new National Cabinet that went through that long list of measures that Ange outlined earlier meets again on Friday, this time to consider, among other things, cafes, bars and other places with fewer than 100 people inside and the kind of restrictions they might need to face. The G20, the World Economic Forum, has already announced plans for a virtual leaders meeting of the 20 biggest economies on earth, including Australia and Scott Morrison. So the Prime Minister likely to bring new measures out of that next week. And third, his economic ministers are already formulating a second round of economic stimulus and protection for businesses to buffer them against what many now predict will be a recession, Michael.
All right, so what's the timeline on the second round of stimulus? How soon until that's finalised, Tim?
Likely it will be done by the beginning of next week, Michael. Parliament plans here a virus-shortened week sitting next week and then is due to rise for 6 weeks, way too long for economic measures in these circumstances to sit on the shelf. The government is pretty likely for any plans now in the pipeline to want them through Parliament before MPs leave here next week, Michael.
All right, good on you, Tim. Tim Lester in Canberra, thank you. Now, before the show tonight, I spoke with Foreign Minister Marise Payne about those new level 4 travel restrictions and what they will mean for Australians. Well, Minister, thank you for joining the latest. I want to first ask you about the updated travel advice urging Australians not to travel at this time. The Prime Minister was talking about a 6-month period for all of these conditions. How long do you expect that this will be the case?
Michael, we've put this in place from this morning, obviously, and I think the Prime Minister's indicated what we think perhaps the timing may be, but the challenge with dealing with a pandemic, dealing with the coronavirus issue, is that it is difficult to measure that. But if we plan towards 6 months, I think that's appropriate. What we're saying to Australians at this time is do not travel overseas for your own health and safety.
Look, there'd be many Australians with holidays booked over the rest of the year. Should they be cancelling now?
There will be a lot of Australians who have made bookings, I understand that, and certainly for those that are in the upcoming few months, our advice is not to travel overseas. Many hotels, accommodation providers, airlines, insurance agents are working very hard to support consumers in this time. They are able to make alternative arrangements, and we do encourage them, of course, to do so. I know that lots of Australians will have saved up, will have planned for family visits, will have planned for holidays that are very special to them. But the challenge of being in countries that don't have health systems that are like Australia's, and the challenge also of very, very quick changes and disruptions to travel and to border arrangements, to movement within countries they might be visiting, it really is advisable, and that is why we have, for the first time in Australia's history since we have been providing travel advice, indicated they should not travel overseas.
Minister, the other message that was released last night was also come home, get home as soon as possible. But today we're seeing a lot of the airlines cancel a large number of international flights. Some are finding themselves a bit stuck. What's your advice to those Australians abroad right now?
This is an ongoing challenge and we understand that, but where there are commercial means available and travellers were intending to come home, we encourage them to do so now. There are many Australians overseas at any given time, hundreds and hundreds of thousands in fact, but I do encourage Australians to be calm, to be sensible, to seek advice through our Smart Traveller website, which is available for their access at any time, to use that, and if they find themselves in a difficulty where they think our consular emergency system can help us, then of course to contact them as well.
You were in the US, I think, on official visit last week. Have you been tested for COVID-19?
I was in the United States and I, on the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, am doing what is required in terms of social distancing. I have had to the best of my knowledge, no engagement with anyone with coronavirus and no symptoms of coronavirus. So in terms of social distancing, 1.5 metres is the space around me at all times and basically sticking to that medical advice.
As a senior member of our government minister, what advice do you have for Australians, just as a general message? It's stressful. A lot of people are feeling it. There's a lot of people having sleepless nights. What's your personal message out there?
Michael, I would say I absolutely understand that. For families and for individuals, this is a very difficult time, but it's not like anything we have experienced really in our lifetime, except perhaps for the most elderly in our community. I feel for them at the moment. This is a very challenging time. We know that they are even more vulnerable to coronavirus than many other people in the community. It's really important, I think, to pull together and to make sure also that in terms of when we are trying to resource our families, when we're trying to make sure we've got the supplies that we need, that we're not overdoing it. Australia has really solid supply chains for food and for grocery products, better than many in the world, in fact. And all we do when we rush the stores is disadvantage those who are the most challenged. So please, let's pull together. Let's all work together as a country on this and make sure that we can get through it, because I know we can.
Foreign Minister Marise Payne, we appreciate you joining The Latest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Now, let's go to Melbourne, where the AFL has tonight decided to push ahead with round one of the season. Let's bring in our chief AFL reporter, Mark Stevens. Now, Steve, hello to you. Now, less than 24 hours until the season open. I tell you what, the decision went right down to the wire.
Absolutely, Michael, right down to the wire. We had a press conference at 7:45, which was 90 minutes after the teams for the first game between Carlton and Richmond were actually announced. So we're in the dark as far as what was going to happen. And finally, Gil McLachlan announced that we will have footy. There will be no crowds tomorrow night. In fact, there may be no crowds for the entire season, given the 6-month plan that was outlined this morning by the government. So the footy forges ahead without any supporters. They're quite happy with the medical advice they've got that it's safe to do so. Certainly mixed reactions in some quarters, the fact that other sports internationally have given the footy away. But there was a long commission meeting today. In the end, they're the conscience of the AFL. The CEOs wanted it, the club CEOs, but in the end, the commission has backed it in. So footy we do have, Michael.
All right, well, let's have a listen now to what the AFL boss, Gil McLachlan, had to say about this.
We must go forward day by day, listening to the advice, and continue to make the best decisions for our industry while balancing well-being, welfare, leadership and economic and social impacts. We don't know how many games we will get into this 153-game journey before we have to pause. Tonight, our industry is unified in making a decision to start.
All right, so Steve-o, we should mention that they're not the only ones. The NRL, it's going ahead with its second round this weekend. Both codes with empty stands. So what's the mood around the footy world in all of this? What do you think?
Well, it's all very strange, and I think on Seven's coverage, you'll see the sounds of the game tomorrow night are going to be very different indeed. But I think the fans are overjoyed tonight. I've had a lot of comments and messages. We had a Carlton supporter down here at AFL House. They're celebrating. They want something to enjoy in life at the moment, and it's a real ray of light that footy's back. But just briefly, some bad news for AFLW players at the moment. Some of those are in tears. They've called off the last 2 rounds, and they're rushing to the finals, Michael. So a few clubs, in fact, most of the clubs have now had their season cut short. So a different story with the AFLW.
Oh, that's disappointing for them. There's no doubt about it. All right, good on you, Mark Stevens in Melbourne. Thanks for that tonight. Well, it's a new reality for all of us with the government's tough new measures to combat the spread of coronavirus now in effect. Denham Hitchcock is here to break it down for us, the rules, what they mean for you. He's at the desk. Denham, good evening to you. So, here's the big question. What's still open? I guess the question, where can we go?
It's a big list, so let's go straight into it. Schools remain open. That's the first one, and that'll be important for a lot of parents. They'll be relieved to hear that, and it's been a big decision for a lot of other countries for the moment. I'm going to add for the moment on that one. So gyms and pools, that's another one that stays open. Public transport, that also will remain running. Supermarkets, thankfully. Pharmacies, offices, hotels, although I have seen today that some hotels are saying that there'll be minimal people allowed, not so many people allowed into rooms. Certain floors won't have as many people allowed. So
interesting point, in pubs where there's pokies, they're going to turn every second pokey off to space people out.
That's
part
right.
of that social distancing.
Keep people apart. Yep. It's all about that 1.5 metres, and that's very important. Parliament, prisons, thankfully, will remain operating. There's restrictions on student nurses are going to be lifted. I'm going to call this one out and say that this is part of the devil in the detail, because this is very important and it's kind of buried here. But if our care service goes down, our nurses, our hospitals, our GPs, we've got a serious, serious problem. So this is a first step. If that happens, care workers start to go down, GPs can't see anything, then student nurses are going to be coming in. There'll be
I think
more
there's about 20,000 of them as well. I think
quite a lot
mentioned this morning. OK, what's out?
OK, what's out? Indoor gatherings over 100 people. Forget about it. Outdoor gatherings over 500, that's also out. All public Anzac Day commemorations cancelled. That's both domestic and international. I know you saw this as well. There's a bit of a grassroots movement at the moment to have people celebrate at the end of their driveways to observe the silence at 6 a.m. I love that. Personally, I like it. No group visits to aged care facilities. That also is very important. We'll get into that more. You know, I've been crunching the data for you all week this week. And that is important, because that age group of 80 plus, that we have to wrap them in cotton wool. So, you know, no visits for people under 16 can get in there. So we've got to be careful with that. Do not travel overseas. Level 4 travel restrictions. That was a big one today. We have turned into Fortress Australia.
Just to briefly, who's going to be most affected by all of this? I noticed in Sydney alone this afternoon, one of the big wedding chains venues, it's closed for 6 weeks. Hundreds of weddings being cancelled. Who's most affected?
How would you be if your wedding got cancelled because of coronavirus? I know, but this is part of it, isn't
postponed,
it?
I guess. So everyone's just saying, let's postpone.
Postpone, OK, let's say postpone. People will be devastated, but life has got to change. People have got to move on. So, look, Australia's pubs and clubs, this list at the moment, this is very small, Michael, and it is going to grow. It is going to grow as we go. But the pubs and clubs, we know they're going to be affected. Restaurants, cinemas. I noticed Hoyts came out today. They said they're block booking every second seat. So similar to the pokies you mentioned, there'll be space around you, weddings, funerals. The PM had it right. Everyone, just don't panic. Don't hoard. Don't panic buy. We can get through it.
All right, Denham, thanks for that. Now, look, I want to show you something. This is, I'll hold it up here. Full-page ad taken out today in most of the papers. I'll hold that there. Working together to provide for all Australians. This came from a coordination of all of the major supermarkets. Now, they joined forces to beg customers to stop the buying frenzy and remember that supermarkets are no place for abuse and aggression. And this was the queue at Costco. That was in Sydney today. Police brought in for crowd control. And Scott Morrison, as we heard earlier, blasted the panic buying, calling it ridiculous and un-Australian, of course. Now, obviously, people are worried about running out of food and essentials. Let's go straight to the people who supply the supermarkets and hear from them. Jeffrey Anderson's with the Food and Grocery Council. Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining the latest. Look, some of the shelves are bare. Do we have a shortage of food and basic necessities? What's the truth here?
The truth is absolutely not. Australia produces enough food for a population of about 75 million. Our population is about 25 million. We've got 3 times the amount of food produced in Australia that we absolutely need.
OK, the supply chain, let's talk about that, because no doubt their workplaces as well, they may well be affected by all sorts of restrictions. Can we keep the shelves stocked? Is the supply chain going to be affected?
Well, the problem at the moment is essentially it's a demand surge, and of course the strategy of the government under the health authorities is to restrict the speed at which the COVID virus affects people. So if the government is right, and we have every reason to believe that that's the case, we don't think it will impact too much on the suppliers. We think that their workforce will be maintained and that suppliers will go through to supermarkets very smoothly.
We're seeing the vision there, though, of course. Toilet paper, hand sanitizer. I know some people are really worried that we rely on production of that in China. For some of it, stocks may run out. What's your view of that? What's your information?
Well, in the case of toilet paper, for example, we have 3 manufacturers in Australia. They've ramped up production. They're working 24/7, literally, and I'm sure that as these supplies come through and people realise that there's no necessity to buy toilet paper in such great amounts, then the supermarket shelves will refill.
So do you see any scenario at all where some of these supplies won't be restocked, that there may be empty shelves for quite some time, that the supply is severely affected?
The short answer is no. We have every confidence that under the plans put in place to control the spread of the COVID virus, that we'll be able to maintain the effectiveness of the supply chain in keeping the shelves of the supermarkets essentially full.
You have got good advice here. So what you're saying is be reassured, it's fine. Just be patient. Those shelves will fill again.
That's exactly right.
All right, good on you. Jeffrey Anderson, thank you for joining The Latest.
Thank you.
With social distancing measures increasing, working from home has quickly become more common. It has Australian telcos under pressure with a major surge in demand. Telstra CEO Andrew Penn joins me now. Andy, thanks so much for joining The Latest this evening. First question broadly, how will the government's new measures affect services such as Telstra's?
Pleasure, Michael. Great to be on the show. Look, it's certainly unprecedented times, and telecommunications has rapidly become one of the most critical services because we're also dependent on being connected these days. So our number one focus is how do we make sure that we are setting up our operations in such a way that we can maximise people's connection if they are working from home, because it does have some consequences.
The NBN today released, if that's the right terminology, another 40% of capacity to pass on to retailers such as yourself. How does that affect services, and can you pass that directly on for people working from home?
Yeah, so the way to think about this, Michael, is that ordinarily if we're all at work or we're studying at school or at university or we're working with the government, those organisations, those departments usually typically have dedicated high-capacity fibre links themselves. And so they have their own network, essentially, which Telstra, broadly speaking, provides. What's going to happen is if people start working from home and studying from home, they're going to go onto a different part of the network, which is essentially the sort of the residential part of the network, which is basically the NBN and mobile. And what we've got to do collectively as an industry is to make sure we dimension capacity in that part of the network to deal with a set of business volumes that it wasn't previously designed to do. And that's what you've heard today from NBN, increasing capacity by 40%, which will flow all the way through to that part of the network.
So can your capacity handle the tens of thousands of extra people that are going to be working from home?
Well, we are working very hard to make sure that it does, and undoubtedly there'll be some pinch points, there'll be some areas which we'll need to keep an eye on, but we're working closely as an industry to try and make sure that that is absolutely the case.
Two brief points. Your call centres, your customer service centres offshore that help customers here, are they reliable at the moment? Are they being affected? And what of Telstra's own staff in Australia? 30,000 staff, another 30,000 contractors, if you like. Are they having to go into lockdown as well?
So we made the bold decision on Friday of last week that we would move 20,000, which is about 70% of our Australian-based workforce, in office workforce, to working from home. So we have 20,000 people now working from home, including myself. In addition to that, we've got people in our call centres. We have about 15,000 people in our call centres. Much harder to work from home in the call centre just because of the technology. Some of those are offshore, but 4,000 are onshore. And one of the dynamics we're facing at the moment is the Philippines, where some of our call centre people are located, has put in quarantine arrangements, which is making it very difficult for people to get in and out of work. And so we're having to prioritise calls and traffic. So, these are just some of the dynamics that we're needing to deal with.
Indeed. All right, Andy Penn, the CEO of Telstra, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Michael.
And still to come, we speak with a Queensland senator who's right now suffering from coronavirus. Is ibuprofen harmful? Does your blood type make you more susceptible? One of Australia's top doctors busts some of the major myths about COVID-19. Advice for parents. This is important on dealing with the pandemic panic. And will the $715 million stimulus package be enough to bail out our airlines? It's all coming up next on the latest from 7 News. Well, Queensland LNP Senator Susan McDonald is tonight self-isolating at home after being released from a Townsville hospital. The politician's being confirmed as having coronavirus. Let's bring in Ange Cox in the studio now. Ange, hello to you. Now, you spoke to Senator McDonald earlier.
That's right, and she's actually one of 3 Australian politicians who've been diagnosed with the coronavirus. It's understood that none of those cases were related in any way. And for the senator, her symptoms were actually surprisingly mild. Senator Susan McDonald, thanks so much for joining us on The Latest. Tell us, when did you become concerned that you might have coronavirus?
Yeah, so last Friday afternoon, I got a slight temperature. I had a sore, kind of a dusty throat, as if I'd been in the cattle yards, needed to drink water. But I felt that Peter Dutton had been diagnosed that day, and it was the Cowboys-Broncos game that night. I didn't want to put anybody at risk, so I went and got tested and self-isolated while I waited for the results to come back.
So you went into the emergency department at Townsville Base Hospital. How seriously was the situation treated by the staff there?
The staff at Townsville Hospital have been extraordinary, so professional, very organised. They've got a great plan. And so I did ring ahead, and so they met me at the door with a mask, took me straight in. I think I was one of their early tests.
We're all so scared about coronavirus and catching it. You've had it, one of the few people so far. What is it like? Did you feel horribly ill?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm very fortunate or this is how it will be for a large section of the population. But apart from that Friday afternoon when I felt like I was coming down with something, the next day I felt tired, a couple of headaches. By Sunday I was feeling okay. By Monday when the results came in and the hospital called and said you've got to come in, I felt fine.
We've heard some people compare it to jet lag. Is that the sort of experience you had?
Yeah, I guess that's not a bad example, feeling a bit tired, a bit lethargic, but that's been the worst of it for me.
So tell me about when you got that positive test result. Were you concerned?
I was really surprised, but by that stage I'd been at home for 3 days. I knew I was feeling better each day, and so then it was really just my concern about who I'd been in contact with and letting everybody know so that they could then start watching their own symptoms.
Do you know where you got the virus?
No, I don't, and I've been thinking about that. But I guess nobody wears a funny hat or carries a flag to say I've got coronavirus. So I don't know where it was. I do travel a lot.
So just to be clear, the people you came in contact with, your staff, are they now all in self-isolation?
Indeed they are. So everybody's at home, isolated and just looking after themselves.
OK, thank you so much for your time tonight, Senator.
Yeah.
Take care.
So, Michael, she actually has to stay in self-isolation now until she has 2 separate tests done 24 hours apart that show she's in the clear.
All right, well, she's looking okay. It's interesting hearing from a few people that the symptoms are relatively mild, though. That's the reassuring part of it to a degree.
Yes, and what's interesting, though, we keep getting told it's the fever. That's what distinguishes it. She didn't have a fever, so you do have to be careful.
Ange, thank you for that. Now, stick around. We're going to look at our segment now, tracking the data on this crisis. We've called it the COVID curve, and reporter once again, Denham Hitchcock, has been looking after it for us. Denham, good evening to you again. So, communication, information, it's our strongest weapon. What have you got for us today on the curve?
It certainly is. We've got some great data today. 1918, 50 million people died from the Spanish flu, but they don't have what we have, and data is very important. So this is the death rate, the COVID death rate, and you can see 0 to 9, very interesting, not a single death. And as it goes through the curve here, through the age groups, it climbs and it climbs. And you can see by the time that you get to 80 plus, you're looking at 14.8%, and they're the people that we need to protect. So 80 plus, 14.8%. In some countries like Italy, it's as high as 18%.
So that's like from the age of 50 on, it starts to really kick in. What are you looking at there?
So this is the infection rate. Now, this is very, very interesting. And you'll see this graph looks very different. I'm going to explain it. Again, down the bottom, these are the ages. So these are the age groups that run down the bottom, and these are the percentages. Now, this is the infection rate. So this is the people, the percentage of people that had COVID. So what you'll notice is the big spike on 2029. So these are the people that had the most amount. This is almost 30% of that age group, 20 to 29, were carriers of that disease. So not the people that were passing away from it. Down here, they're very low, but 20 to 29. And if you remember from the last graph, that age group only had a mortality rate of 0.2%. So it's a very social group. They're going out and about. We've got to be careful about this age group. They need to be careful.
What country is that from?
That's a good question, because that is South Korea. And I'll tell you why it's a good question. In China and in Italy, they only tested the people that were sick. But in South Korea, they tested everybody. So China was skewed towards the age group that is down there. But in South Korea, they tested everybody. So this is the real data that you need to look at.
Rigorous testing.
Okay, let's have a look at the next one.
Now, this is interesting because this goes to exactly what is... well, hang on, what rate is that there?
So this is COVID versus flu. And I don't know about you, but when this first started, I told everyone, including my wife, don't worry about it. It's nothing worse than the flu. That's all we're looking at. It's just a simple flu. It's not. And this is the data that proves that. You're 80 plus. These are the death rates, 0.83% here for the flu and 14.8%. And as I said, up to 18% in Italy. So very different from the flu.
All right. Good on you. Denham with the COVID curve. Thank you very much for that. Still to come, Europe closes its borders as the pandemic crisis escalates. How parents can keep their kids calm and happy during self-isolation, important advice. And are certain blood types more susceptible to COVID-19? We asked one of the country's top medical minds. It's all coming up next here on the latest from 7 News. As fears over the pandemic heightens, as do conspiracies and myths on the virus. So here to clear up quite a few of them is our infectious diseases physician, Sanjaya Senanayak. Sanjaya, really good to see you again. Thanks for being with the latest again. Now, let me ask you, most recently, stories have been circulating wildly online suggesting it's dangerous to take ibuprofen if you have coronavirus. Myth?
So this is an interesting one, Michael. It's an evolving story, but you're quite right. A BBC article showed that a lot of false stories have been put out there. It stems from the fact in France, 4 patients supposedly didn't do as well with their COVID-19 when they were taking non-steroidals like ibuprofen, and it's been looked at in the past that using non-steroidals like ibuprofen in other respiratory illnesses may sometimes mean you have a slightly worse illness. Now, having said all that, it hasn't been proven in COVID-19 as yet. And the government yesterday said that it's fine to take ibuprofen, but the World Health Organization is saying maybe not until we look into it further. Right. So it's a watch this space.
We'll put that in the unproven category for now. A new study in China has also suggested people with a certain blood type may be more susceptible to the coronavirus. Your take on that?
So, yes. Look, we do know that there is an association with infectious diseases and blood types. So, for example, people who've got a blood abnormality called sickle cell anemia are protected against malaria. So that's one interesting example. So, look, it is possible that this blood group A people, they may be more susceptible to COVID-19, but the problem is it's only one sample of patients and it may not be replicated when you look at larger numbers of patients. So it's interesting, but not definitively proven.
All right, put it in the unproven category again. Still conspiracies around where the virus originated and if it's man-made. We have spoken about this. Let's clarify that point, Sanjaya.
Look, at this stage, we do not think it is man-made. It's a biologically plausible story that this virus came from bats. It found some sort of intermediate animal host, and then found the opportunity to mutate and jump across to humans, possibly in the live markets that we see in China.
All right. It's false on that one. Then finally, does surviving COVID-19 give you immune protection? A lot of people asking this.
Researchers in Melbourne did immune studies on a patient who had a mild case of COVID-19, and they published that data in the Nature magazine very recently, and that showed that there is a good immune response involving antibodies and other part of the immune system against COVID-19 to beat it. So there definitely is an immune response in these milder cases. Now, how long those immune responses, those antibodies last for is still unclear, but one would have thought, if we think about other coronaviruses, at least a couple of years.
All right, that's some good news, which we'll end on there. Sanjaya, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
Still to come, the coronavirus clears the streets of London. A Tokyo Olympics boss tests positive to COVID-19. What does that mean for the Games? Airlines in crisis as the PM announces an international travel ban. And the top concerns kids have about this global pandemic. We'll address that. It's all coming up on the latest from 7 News. In Europe, all non-essential travel has been banned as the UK steps up its fight against both the economic and the health impacts of coronavirus. Our reporter Alex Hart's in London tonight. Alex, good evening to you. So how are people there coping with the new restrictions?
G'day, Michael. You only have to take one look at Piccadilly Circus, where I'm standing right now, to see that Britons and Londoners more specifically are taking the advice from the government very seriously. This is often described as London's version of New York's Times Square, the big colourful billboards, the big retailers, and this time of the morning, normally a lot of people going to work just after 9 o'clock here, but you can see no problems with social distancing in London at the moment. It's virtually deserted in terms of foot traffic, almost no one coming and going from the tube station right here. A very surreal scene, and the seriousness of the government's advice, which is to work from home if you can. It's not an order at the moment, just advice, and for the elderly to isolate those over 70, really reinforced yesterday by the announcement of the economic rescue package. It's dominating the front pages over here. £350 billion worth, around 700 billion Australian dollars, described as the kiss of death. Health check for all Brits. Stick it up, your virus. Typical tongue-in-cheek response there from the Daily Star. Certainly, as I say, it's reinforcing the seriousness. This UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson saying the government here will do whatever it takes to get through this. But a lot of concern about casual workers in particular. And we know a lot of Australians who come over here on gap years for those working holidays do have casual work in pubs and clubs and bars. And a lot of that work will dry up. So it is possible they will soon be joining the mass exodus of Aussies trying to find their way home, Michael.
It is extraordinary watching you there, Alex. You'd normally be jostled, you'd be shouting, there'd be noise. It's amazing to see it as empty as it is right on that spot. What about these non-essential travel restrictions, which we're about to get into here? What impact is that having on Europe?
Yeah, so this was agreed to and voted on yesterday, the European Union enforcing this non-essential travel ban, so non-European citizens can no longer enter Europe. And it's supposed to be Europeans being able to travel still freely within mainland Europe, but countries there are closing their borders as well. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of huge traffic delays that we're seeing, trucks, 40-kilometre queues trying to get into Poland at the moment. It's causing a lot of confusion, and we're hearing the first reports of plane loads of people being turned around in Germany this morning. On top of that, in France, they're waking up to day 2 of a lockdown there. A lot of warnings about people who didn't have permission to be on the streets. They've increased the fines now to about $250 Australian for people who are caught on the streets there in France, and they will be enforced from today after the warnings yesterday. And I guess concern here in London that they too may see similar arrangements put in place here, given just how quickly the situation is evolving. Michael.
All right, Alex Hart, in a not-so-quiet London town now with the horns, but quiet of people anyway. Good on you, Alex. Thank you for that. And a Tokyo Olympic boss has tested positive for coronavirus. The senior official became infected after travelling to Britain and the United States in the past month. Japan's Prime Minister and the International Olympic Committee insists the Games will still go ahead. It has been a tumultuous time for the airlines, but today a $715 million federal assistance package was announced to keep our carriers from going under. Let's bring in our Network Finance Editor, Gemma Actor, now to have a talk about this. Gem, good evening to you. A welcome relief, but it's a lot of money, but is it enough?
Oh, Michael, I highly doubt it. The global aviation industry has already warned this is going to be significantly worse than the GFC. And we also heard from the Virgin Australia Chief Executive today, Paul Scurrah, who said, thank you very much for the package, we welcome it, but more will likely be needed. And if there is to be more coming, we'd like that sooner rather than later. We also heard in recent days from the Rex Deputy Chairman, which is a regional carrier, saying that there is a big risk they'll be gone within 6 months without substantial support. We remember that Flybe in the UK, another regional carrier, just collapsed itself.
So travel bans, border closures, self-isolation, all contributing to a crude oil sell-off. Not good for the commodity market, but good news for consumers?
Yes, indeed. Oil prices on the global markets have pretty much halved since the start of the year, and that does feed through to the petrol pump here. Usually takes about a week to 10 days, depending on where you live, so certainly we should be seeing that already. Also, we've seen panic buying across all sorts of products. There's absolutely no need here to panic buy petrol. The world is awash with oil at the moment, given that travel demand has collapsed, and along with it, oil demand. And the supply chains that get fuel here to Australia are operating absolutely fine.
So that's all good. The supply chain?
All good.
All right.
Cheaper prices.
Good news. All right, Gemma, thanks for that tonight.
Thank you.
Well, still to come, talking to the kids about coronavirus, the extraordinary step taken by the leader of Norway. It's really interesting. Have a look at it next. How to keep your family healthy and sane during self-isolation, and the touching story behind tonight's final frame. It's an act of real good faith and goodwill. It's all coming up next here on the latest from 7 News. Have a look at this. A great initiative out of Norway. The Prime Minister and two of her ministers holding a media conference just for kids. Erna Solberg told them it's okay to be scared with so many things happening right now, and answered any questions they had.
Welcome to the press conference for children.
How long will it take to make a vaccine for COVID-19?
There will be a vaccine. It may take a year, but it may be earlier.
Why can't I celebrate my birthday this weekend?
This is because we can't gather in groups to limit the infection. Maybe you could be extra creative and try and celebrate via FaceTime.
Can it spread to animals?
We don't know everything about the virus yet. We don't think it infects animals, but we're not sure.
Now, back home in Australia, many families are concerned on how to address the pandemic with their kids and how to keep healthy during isolation. So for more on this, let's bring in our experts, leading paediatrician and infectious diseases specialist, Professor Jonathan Karapetis in Perth, and CEO of Vic Health, Dr. Sandro De Mayo. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Jonathan, I'll start with you if you don't mind. How much should we be telling kids and teenagers about what is going on?
Oh, look, our kids certainly know there's something big happening here, so you can't pretend it's not happening. You need to be honest, but you also need to nuance this as a parent. You need to keep it appropriate for their age. And it's a really good time to teach them about germs and how they're spread. And you also need to be positive. You need to make sure that kids understand that there's something we can do, that we can actually empower them to stop the spread of this bug. You need to make sure that when you're talking to your kids, you're talking to them in a positive way about this virus and about what we can do about it and how we can protect the most vulnerable in our society.
And Sandro, if you are self-isolated at home, what's the advice to families? How can you keep active and healthy if you're cooped up?
Yeah, well, when it comes to exercise, unless you're currently in quarantine, older and frail, or of course currently unwell, you can still head to the park, you can take the dog for a walk, but you need to of course keep distance from other people, maintain the appropriate distance, and of course wash your hands when you return home. When it comes to healthy eating, we have seen some of the supermarket shelves run bare in the last few weeks, but the good news is that fresh, healthy and locally produced food by great farmers here in Australia are still in abundance. We're at the end of summer. Those delicious, tasty and fresh and healthy foods are still available. So we should be eating more of those, boosting our immune system, doing the best thing for our families, our own bodies, and of course they're still continuing to be available.
Jonathan, I know you've looked at the infection rates for children in Australia. What are they?
I think as of this morning, there are a bit over 450 total cases of coronavirus in Australia, really just a handful in kids. This is not a disease that by and large is affecting kids really a lot or very severely. Most of those cases in kids are in the teenagers, very few cases under the age of 10.
Now, they usually, I mean, if they do get it, I understand it's only mild symptoms only, but can children be super spreaders?
So we don't know. This is one of those questions we don't really know the answer to. The evidence we've got is that children, unlike some other viruses, probably aren't super spreaders of this bug in this epidemic. Of course, that doesn't mean we can't assume that they're not transmitting to others, especially the elderly. So we need to be very careful about kids who potentially could be infected.
And Sandra, on that issue with the older people, it can be pretty isolating and lonely when you're having to stay at home and watch yourself. Any advice for them, and just broadly, protecting our mental health during this time? It is a concerning time.
First of all, making sure that we are taking a moment out from the buzz and the hype of media for a few moments, turning off our phones. A lot of stress is due to misinformation, it's due to misunderstanding, it's due to the spread of information that's not correct from non-reputable sources, and that we're listening to the experts and taking heed of their warnings. And I think the last thing is to make sure that while we are isolated physically, it doesn't mean that we need to be isolated from our communities. Making sure that we're picking up the phone, we're staying connected through social media, having Skype calls. If we're working from home, calling into our colleagues regularly throughout the day, making sure we're still joining group calls, group chats, and trying to stay as connected as possible. And if there are elderly or older people living around you, that you're checking in on them, leaving them a note, offering to pick up groceries, offering to help them out if you can, and just making sure that they're okay.
Very good advice. Our experts, we really appreciate your time. Dr. Sandra De Mayo and Professor Jonathan Karapetis, thank you. And we'll be right back with Wednesday's weather forecast and your final frame here on the latest from 7 News. Welcome back. We're taking a look over the Sydney skyline tonight with sunshine expected tomorrow, temps reaching high 20s. Elsewhere around the country, let's have a look at that. Brisbane partly cloudy, reaching 28 tomorrow. Melbourne 30 with possible showers. Adelaide a top of 32. And some other parts, Walgett 31 and sunny. Ceduna a top of 27 degrees. And in Laverton 31. Possible storm in the morning. Well, we usually end on a final frame, but tonight it's a final thought, and that is be kind. Kind like Mike Flynn. He's a double amputee, and our Brisbane crew met him outside a supermarket first thing this morning, there to pick up some essentials. But not for himself, it's for his best mate. They've made a 3K ride uphill in peak hour to deliver them to Pete Milne. Pete's legally blind and has a heart condition, so he's self-isolating at home.
Should be more people like him around, a bit more able-bodied. Now look at him, no legs, and he's still out doing this for me, riding a push bike.
Well, mate, if the roles reversed, you'd do it for me, mate, okay?
There you go. They are mates indeed, and as they told us, that's what friends are for. Bloody good act of kindness. Thank you for your company this evening. You can rewatch all of our shows on 7plus and catch the latest on Facebook Watch every weekday afternoon. Sunrise, of course, is back first thing tomorrow morning from 5:30. For now, though, from the team here at 7 News, that is the latest. I'm Michael Usher. Good night.